So, you've probably seen the story of Rat Park, right? The one about the happy rats who chose to play instead of doing drugs. It's a really powerful idea, and it went absolutely viral. But the real story is so much more interesting and, honestly, way more complicated. Today, we're going to unpack what that famous experiment actually showed and how the media turned a nuanced scientific finding into a simple myth. This is the question that made the whole thing famous. What if the opposite of addiction isn't about willpower or sobriety, but about connection? It's this beautiful idea that our environment, not the drug itself, is the real root of addiction. It's a compelling story for sure. So let's dig into where it all began. All right, to understand this, we have to go back to the late 1970s. We're meeting a Canadian psychologist named Bruce K. Alexander. And he had this nagging feeling that the entire field of addiction science was missing something huge. Alexander looked at how addiction studies were done at the time, and what he saw was pretty grim. You had a single rat, all alone, stuck in a tiny, cramped metal cage. And he thought, well, of course it's taking the drug. What else is there to do in there? He started to wonder if these experiments were really studying addiction, or if they were just studying what happens when you put a social animal in solitary confinement. So what did he do? He built something completely different. He called it Rat Park. And this just shows you the night and day contrast. Instead of that lonely metal box, Rat Park was basically a rat paradise. It was 200 times bigger, it was filled with food, toys, and, this is the most important part, other rats. They could socialize, play, and mate. It was designed to be a happy, fulfilling place for a rat to live. The experiment itself was actually pretty simple. Rats in both settings, the lonely cages and the bustling rat park, were given a choice. They had 2 water bottles. One had just plain tap water. The other had water that was sweetened with morphine. The big question was, would their environment change which bottle they drank from? And the results were, whoa. They weren't just a little different. They were dramatic. The rats who were isolated in their cages drank the morphine water over and over again. In fact, the caged males drank nearly 19 times more morphine solution than the rats living in Rat Park. The park rats, they pretty much ignored the drugged water. They just weren't interested. But then Alexander took it a step further. He thought, okay, what if a rat is already addicted? So he took another group of rats, forced them to become dependent on morphine for almost 2 months, and then he moved them into Rat Park. And you know what happened? Almost as soon as they had a choice, they ditched the morphine and started drinking plain water with hardly any signs of withdrawal. It was like the pull of a good life was just stronger than the pull of the drug. I mean, that sounds incredible, right? It's such a hopeful, amazing story. And that's the version you've probably heard online. But, and you know there's always a but in science, from a scientific point of view, this is where things start to get a little messy. Right. Because the scientific community didn't just see these results and say, great, case closed. No, they immediately started poking holes in it and asking some really tough questions about how the whole thing was run. Critics pointed out a bunch of potential issues. For one, the number of rats in the study was really small. Also, rats were drinking morphine. That's not how humans typically use opioids. Some argued that the morphine solution was bitter, and maybe the happy rats just didn't like the taste. On top of all that, the original papers mentioned things like equipment failures and even lost data, which makes other scientists really nervous. And here's the real kicker in science, replication. Can somebody else do your experiment and get the same results? Well, in the case of Rat Park, the answer was, not really. Later attempts to replicate the study, even one done by Alexander's own student, just couldn't produce those same black and white results. It started to look like, yeah, environment matters, but it's not the only thing going on. So that raises a huge question. If the science was so debated and kind of shaky, how did this story become one of the most famous parables about addiction? Well, this is where the media megaphone comes in, and the story gets amplified and simplified. So the original studies from the 70s were known in academic circles, but they didn't really break into the mainstream for decades. Then, in 2015, a hugely popular TED Talk blew the story up. That talk then got turned into an animated YouTube video that got something like 19 million views. The problem was, as the creators of that video later admitted, the story they told was an oversimplification that didn't properly represent the actual evidence. They even took the video down because of it. And this is really the heart of the problem. The media narrative took all the nuance, all the complexity, and just flattened it. It turned a study that suggested environment is an important contributing factor into a story that said environment is the only thing that matters. It took a really complex problem and offered a simple, tidy answer. So, if the viral story is a myth, should we just toss the whole experiment out? Absolutely not. Because the real legacy of Rat Park is still incredibly important. It just changed how we think about addiction in a much more subtle way. The most brilliant thing Rat Park did was shine a giant spotlight on what scientists call a confounding variable. Basically, an outside influence you didn't account for that messes up your results. For decades, addiction researchers had a massive confounding variable staring them in the face: the cage itself. What Rat Park really forced scientists to do was to take a hard look at their own methods. It made them ask, are the animals in our control groups even healthy to begin with? Or have we just been studying the behavior of stressed out, isolated animals and calling it a baseline? It was a huge wake-up call. And that brings us to the modern consensus. You won't find any serious researcher today who thinks Rat Park was useless, but you also won't find one who thinks it's the whole story. This quote sums it up perfectly. It is a big mistake to say environment is the only factor. Rat Park is a critical piece of a much, much bigger puzzle. So in the end, even though the viral story got the science wrong, the real legacy of Rat Park leaves us with this incredibly powerful question. It pushes us to look beyond just brain chemistry and ask ourselves, if an empty, lonely cage can change a rat's choices so drastically, what are the cages in our own world? Things like poverty, isolation, trauma, lack of opportunity, and how are those cages shaping the choices people around us make every single day?